You are listening to the War on the Rocks podcast on strategy, defense, and foreign affairs. My name's Ryan Evans. I'm the founder of War on the Rocks. In this episode, we have a pretty fun debate about some big issues related to strategy, priorities, diplomacy, and more. Hope you enjoy this discussion with Wess Mitchell of the Marathon Initiative, Stacie Pettyjohn of the Center for a New American Security, and Justin Logan of the Cato Institute. So, Wes, you wrote this op-ed that appeared in the print edition of the Washington Post, at least about, a week ago. And I read it while I was getting some coffee, and I thought it was very interesting and thoughtful, and it made me want to get this group together. So just tell us briefly what the argument was.
Sure. Well, first of all, Ryan, thanks for putting this together. It's an important topic and great to be with you guys. So my position, and this is what is argued in the op-ed, is that the most serious strategic challenge facing the United States is what military guys call the simultaneity problem. And this is the problem of a potential multi-front war that would outstrip current U.S. military resources. So we have three major adversaries, China, Russia, Iran, and several smaller ones. We have basically one major war military. So we have two national defense strategies have said that very bluntly. I'm assuming the next national defense strategy will say that. So my starting point is that's the organizational problem. We don't have enough resources. We have too many enemies. So the question then becomes, how do we handle this? And so my argument is the optimal strategy would be a sequencing strategy or sequential strategy, where we try with the resources we have now, military as well as diplomacy, allies, to tourniquet the secondary and tertiary theaters, the situation in Ukraine, situation in Middle East, with a view to concentrating our military resources in the near future against the main rival, which is China. So that's the basic argument. The reason I think this is the right strategy, it plays to our enemy's disadvantages. Putin moved on a quicker timetable in Ukraine than Xi was prepared to move against Taiwan. And I think we should punish that. He moved incompetently. And now with the Iran strikes, these were shockingly successful. If somebody had told us a year ago, Iranian power is going to be degraded to a point where their air defenses are gone, maybe half or more of their ballistic missiles. And by the way, if we haven't obliterated their nuclear program, which it looks like we have, then we've set it back a lot.
And you try to paint that as the beginning of what could be a successful sequencing strategy, right? As you say, we did this in Iran, big success. Now let's shift focus to the next is basically what you're trying to argue.
So I've been arguing for a sequencing strategy since basically slightly before the Ukraine war, but consistently through the Ukraine war. What's been inconvenient for that argument up until recently is that we haven't used the last 2 or 3 years of the Ukraine war wisely, and our adversaries have. We haven't replenished stocks. Our defense industrial base is in bad shape. So what's changed? Well, a couple of things since the start of the second Trump term. One, the Iran strikes, right? So our tertiary enemy has been set back by several years, probably. And what that means in concrete terms is in a Taiwan contingency, the Chinese couldn't assume that a big part of our forces would have to look over their shoulder at the Middle East. But the second thing is what's happening in Europe. So the Trump administration's successful push, and it's been very successful. I was just in Europe, and the Germans are serious about it. There is a major turning point underway in Europe that within the next 3 to 5 years, the secondary theater, our allies there will be in a materially better place. So the heart of the strategy then is, hold the line for the next couple of years, give the Ukrainians the leverage where we can on the battlefield, but with a view to, in 3 to 5 years, our situation is now getting better rather than worse over time, and it's getting worse rather than better for the Chinese. So that's the heart of the argument. Use the clock well.
Do you buy it, Stacie?
I want to buy it, but I don't entirely, in part because I think there are problems with this particular administration in being able to execute it. The strategy you lay out relies on some artful diplomacy and probably diplomatic strategy that would take some time to execute. And it's not clear to me that they have the wherewithal to stick with it or the resources. I think in some ways, you underestimate the amount of resources it would take to settle the situation with Syria and Turkey, and then between Saudi Arabia and Israel, and that in the meantime, you're going to find the Pacific region and Pacific allies are feeling more and more neglected because they've been hearing this for decades now, where we're pivoting, but we haven't really pivoted.
Trust us, you're next.
Yeah. My boss, Richard Fontaine, wrote a whole book on this, why we haven't pivoted. And I think they can understand, we're going to just finish Afghanistan, then we'll get there, and we'll be there soon. And that it would take more time to actually solidify that and more resources. We would need to sweeten the deal, right? There's going to have to be U.S. financial, probably military assistance that's provided. I like the idea of buying time, but I also worry that it's not taking into consideration that time isn't always on our side. We've wasted a tremendous amount of time, which you're absolutely right about, and our industrial base needs to, it's not even reinvigorated. We need to expand it significantly and make a lot more investments in industry to actually provide the type of capabilities we need. But Russia's doing the same thing too. So while Europe's going to be building up and the US would be building up, Russia's already jump-started its defense industry and is pumping out drones, air defense systems, and it's limited by the sanctions, but it doesn't seem to be actually having that much of a material effect on the military. So we would face a greater threat there. It's not like the situation is static.
Justin?
I mean, I think it's a welcome development that we're having a debate about scarcity and about strategic solvency. I mean, it goes back to Walter Lippmann talking about solvency. And then, of course, Samuel Huntington's Foreign Affairs article in 1988, really bad timing, coping with the Lippmann gap. There wasn't much of a Lippmann gap, it turns out, at all. And then it was off to the races with the sort of unipolar United States in the post-Cold War era. So I'm sort of invigorated by the idea that strategy is about priorities. There's a whole school of thought called prioritizers with which we're all familiar. So I think this is like the right debate to be having. I think that the central problem here is that we're already underwater in a sense, and you identify this in the piece and in the argument. But if you look, this Defense Department review of Patriots and other platforms that were throttled for a week to Ukraine and then unthrottled, there was reporting in The Guardian that based on current U.S. defense plans, we have about 25% of the Patriots that we would need in those scenarios. That's a real problem today. And so my point of view, I work at the Cato Institute, this has to be my point of view, is that we've been carrying the load, particularly in Europe and in the Middle East, when we shouldn't have been. We should have offloaded the European problem to the Europeans in the 1990s. It's very easy for a think tank dork to say we should have done something different 30 years ago, but it happens to be true.
And you have been consistent on this.
But very consistent to very little effect. But, European NATO countries have 10 times Russia's GDP, 5 or 6 times its population. Already, depending on how you use purchasing power parity and market exchange rates, they already spend more on defense than Russia does. And we've seen Russia flounder in Ukraine. And I would submit that a Russia that has a hard time subjugating Ukraine is not a hegemonic threat in Europe. So we should be actively, aggressively offloading the Europe problem to the Europeans. And the Trump administration is maintaining Biden-level troop levels in Europe, not showing any signs of withdrawing the 20,000 additional troops that Biden sent in 2022 to reassure the Europeans. We shouldn't reassure the Europeans. We should make them a little antsy. They should get anxious about their security.
To be fair, I think Trump has made them feel quite antsy.
I think that's right. I was in Brussels in April, and I came in with the message that my understanding was that the Trump administration wanted to hand off the conventional deterrence mission to the Europeans, and I thought I was going to be sort of ridden out of the room in every meeting that I had. And there was a real sort of acquiescence to that reality that surprised me. My concern is that they've taken the Hague Declaration, for example, and pocketed that. You have Matt Whitaker saying, this means that the defense of Europe is no longer on the back of the American worker. Well, yes, it is, because paper commitments to do something 10 years in the future can't replace U.S. troops today. We need to sort of hit the gas pedal, and my concern is that the Trump administration has a limited attention span and a limited ability to follow through in the 3 remaining years of the administration.
Where do you think Asia does fit in or should fit in?
At the top. I represent this sort of restraint camp. And I think, everybody that I know says to varying degrees, China's the big problem. Now, some people think it's pretty big. Some people think it's hardly big at all, but it's the main problem. So there's a real consensus in my sort of circles that you start for defense planning, which is very slow, as we know, lumbering and under-resourced for our objectives in the world. So my camp says we ought to pull our horns in certain parts of the world so that we can start with the big thing. And that, I think, the debate, to get back to Wes's argument here, the debate that we're having is really one school of thought, which includes a lot of disparate people, says we face scarcity, we face trade-offs, and we need to prioritize. And the other side says, no, we don't. It's like the old Onion article about the Iraq War that, this will set off a giant versus no, it won't. So I think that's the right debate to be having, and it's telling that how disparate and diverse the scarcity side is, and how sort of underspecified the other side is.
Before I hand it back over to Wes, I just want to say one thing, which is I totally agree with you on troop levels in Europe. I do think that it's time for the Trump administration to follow through with Secretary Hegseth said at the Munich Security Conference and reduce the number of U.S. troops in Europe, although I am very much in favor of continuing to support Ukraine through material. And I think this way of selling U.S. material to the Europeans, which is then given to Ukraine, is a sensible way forward.
I just wanted to disagree with you, Ryan.
Sure.
I think that...
Wait, on my show?
On your show, I'm going to disagree with you. I think that a lot of the forces that are in Europe are not the ones we need in the Pacific. Heavy armor brigades, leave them there. I'm fine with that in the short term, at least. There are some of those high demand assets like air defenses that are more in need in the Pacific, but some of the things where they can be differentiated, I think you keep them there. I'm all for moving out of the Middle East, and I think you're
yes, I think we should.
And the impulse between your approach behind your idea is absolutely the right one. I just question the ability of this administration to execute it, and I think it relies on the assumption that the United States has the initiative and that the adversaries aren't going to react and try to disrupt this, and that it was easier for Israel to do this against a bunch of different proxy forces and Iran, which is not a great power, and it's a harder thing that would require a lot of effort and skill against multiple great powers and then some of the tertiary powers.
I agree with the overall thrust of that. And where did the Patriot system that we sent to Israel come from? It came from the Indo-Pacific. And that's the Middle East is where the most acute trade-offs have been. But Wes, you've been waiting very patiently.
At the top, let me just say that Justin is exactly right. We're in an era of trade-offs. And strategy is choice under conditions of constraint, of scarcity. So we have to grapple with that. And anyone who right now is selling something different than that is either knowingly or unknowingly pulling the wool over people's eyes. It's a very serious problem in U.S. strategy. Our resources are stretched thin. With time and political will and spending, we can address that. But I'm skeptical that any time in our lifetime, we're going to be able to overawe all of our adversaries simultaneously in the way that we did in the 1990s. So that's exactly right. The question is, where do we accept risk when? So that's something that we have some degree of control over. And Stacie, where I think you're wrong is when you say that the current administration is incapable of formulating policies that would respond to the opportunities in front of us. Think about how Biden approached the war in Ukraine and the situation in the Indo-Pacific. His approach was basically the worst of all worlds. It was maximal rhetoric on Ukraine, right? So like freedom itself is at stake, but that did not align with kind of a paltry U.S. effort, or it wasn't always clear what we were doing there or why. In the Indo-Pacific, the administration did not strengthen our deterrence posture in consequential ways in the Indo-Pacific, and extended kind of clumsy olive branches to the Chinese, which sent confusing signals. So now we're in Trump 2. If you look at the situation in the Middle East, I mean, the reality is the administration did respond very effectively in a way that limited our exposure, like at the cost of whatever, a dozen big bombs. We were able to help an ally degrade a very serious adversary. Ukraine.
We don't have that many more of those bombs left.
It's true.
Said.
It's true. So the situation in Ukraine, I would just say, unlike the Biden administration, the Trump administration took a diplomacy-first approach. We're now 6 months into that. And the fact that the president is shifting gears and saying, okay, we won't extend the olive branch indefinitely. If we need to, we'll help the Ukrainians get leverage on the battlefield. That's exactly the right approach. And I think particularly in the summer, where Putin's troops are trying to make gains on the battlefield before the fall rains come, I think it's exactly the moment to say, look, we're perfectly fine with continuing to arm the Ukrainians. Where we can, I think there can be prudential decisions about which weapon systems are most needed in Asia, but a combination of leverage for the Ukrainians, sanctions or tariffs bill. But then the final point that I would make is just coming back to Justin, the prioritizers aren't necessarily wrong. China is the main threat. So my former colleague, Bridge Colby, I think has done a very good job of identifying China as the main threat and saying we have to accept trade-offs elsewhere. He may be right. My view as a sequencer is simply that Ukraine as a crisis is underway. The enemy gets a vote. And I don't want an Afghanistan-style situation where suddenly Russian troops are like at Kiev or the Dnieper. And I think that's the moment at which the administration would have to take it seriously. And it's far better to do what they're doing, which is to say, play a better hand early while we can, with the goal still being to concentrate against China as part of the sequencing strategy.
Just to jump in there, Bridge is a friend of mine too. I haven't really talked to him since he took this job, but the sequencing is fine. But when it comes to Stacie's point about policymaking, the way to do that is not to sort of at the last minute cancel a pretty small security package. I don't blame Bridge for whatever was apparently the poorly coordinated interagency stuff. I think that happened above his head. But that's, I think, not the right way to do it. I think it's more about this patient, concerted, whole of government way of doing it that involves diplomacy. And as my friend, Ambassador Magyarski, the former Polish ambassador to the U.S., has said, that's one thing he's concerned about, is that diplomacy, per Stacie's point, takes patience, takes coordinating all these things. It takes not giving up on talks just because they don't work out in 2 weeks. And I think that's where this administration has fallen short.
I would just add, Wes, I agree with your criticism of the Biden administration in many ways. I don't think they handled the diplomatic side, and I don't think they came close to the goal of integrated deterrence and using all the different tools of power at its disposal in a holistic way. And there is an opportunity here to walk away from the Middle East because the risk has gone down with Iran being so severely degraded right now and its proxies. But where I worry is the fact that this is a really complicated sort of strategy that's going to require people to be there to execute it, right? We just gutted the State Department, and skilled diplomats who know how to make this work, to work across different regions with different countries. I don't think it's going to stick if you're just going to bully people into it in the short term. And I am firmly in the camp of prioritizing China. I'm going to say something that most people don't want to agree with because we've been walking towards global zero, but thinking about relying more heavily on nuclear deterrence in Europe, that the allies and NATO are going to step forward with conventional forces, and the U.S. is going to think about prioritizing deterrence by punishment or whatever euphemism they were using in the last administration, and you focus on conventional deterrence by denial in the Pacific makes sense. And limiting our presence in the Middle East is very much a sensible way of dealing with our resource constraints.
Can I just speak up for bullying our allies? We've talked about the extent to which the enemy gets a vote, which of course is true, but our allies get a vote. So in the great spirit of fighting in the war room, let me sort of suggest that there seems to be a consensus in this room about getting out of the Middle East. Benjamin Netanyahu is not satisfied with the denouement of the campaign in Iran. So I believe that, I believe 10 years ago it was time to get out of the Middle East, but I believe it even more today. But Netanyahu is already talking about what I think you could cynically liken to a sort of mowing the grass strategy, where you're just perennially bombing Iran periodically. And our allies in Europe are working assiduously to try to tie down the Americans so that they don't have to spend 3.5% of GDP on defense. I think they probably don't even need to spend 3.5% of GDP on defense to prevent Russia from sort of dominating Europe. But that's a separate question. But the problem that I think is going to come up is not so much with our adversaries as it is with our allies that are working assiduously to keep us tied down in the respective regions that they care about. And the ability and willingness of an American administration, this or any other, to say, tough luck. It's a scarce situation. We don't have bottomless resources. We're $36 trillion in debt, running $2 trillion a year budget deficits with no real way out, clearly visible. And we're doing less. You're on your own, or you're mostly on your own. And do we think that's a live prospect? I would love to think it is, but I'm sort of cynically suspicious that it may not be.
So, Ryan, let me just start by addressing what you said a moment ago, which I think is important for our discussion. It's about diplomacy. To my mind, the Trump administration has not stepped away from diplomacy. To the contrary.
I don't think they've stepped away from diplomacy. My critique was more about how they're doing it.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, in 6 months' time, we've seen this administration launch more and more consequential diplomatic initiatives in the major regions of the world than probably, I don't know, the last 2 or 3 combined, maybe all post-Cold War presidents combined. So diplomatic outreach to Iran, efforts on Gaza, involvement in the India-Pakistan crisis, and a sustained effort since day one to bring the Ukrainian conflict to a diplomatic resolution. I think the question, linking that to our military discussion here is, where do you have leverage? How do you amass leverage? And how do you use allies in that process? I see 2 good news items on allies. I mean, I take your overall point, Justin, but number one, Ukraine and Israel, small frontline partners of the United States, have basically been deeply degrading the capabilities of 2 of our major adversaries at limited risk to ourselves. So whatever a person's view of the Israeli strikes or the Ukrainian war with Russia, Russia and Iran at the end of this will be weaker than they were at the start of this. And I think that's an important point to absorb. The key for the U.S. is to not take on board the full risk of those frontline allies. Like Ukraine should not be in NATO. Israel, we do also want to play a restraining role on Israel. So if we can maximize the benefits.
I'll believe that when I fucking see it, man. That restraining role on Israel, I don't know about that.
I think with the larger allies, I mean, specifically the Germans, are turning a corner on the willingness to shoulder greater defensive burdens because they're willing to go into debt. I think the sudden realization in all parties in Germany or most parties in Germany, that because of their debt to GDP ratio, they have an option that the Brits and French don't to really finance. So I think that as that comes online, I think people don't realize the sums that we're talking about. It will change the military balance of power in Europe in a way that's positive for us for having the secondary theater manage itself. To my mind, the U.S. risk burden is about the period now until we reach that point. And I think what we want is something like a global Nixon doctrine that says, especially to our wealthiest allies, bear your own burden, especially in conventional defense. We are your ally. We take the higher echelon matters of deterrence very seriously. We take our treaties seriously. But the days when we were bearing, the main burden of defense in 3 regions simultaneously is gone. I think that's the direction we want things to go.
I like the end state picture you're describing, Wes. I just don't think that's really what's happening. I mean, for what Ukraine has had to do, it's had to beg and scrape, even under Biden, and I agree with your critiques of the Biden administration fully. But whereas there's been no debate for supplying Israel in Congress, at least among the people that make decisions. And almost everything Israel has done has actually required on direct military intervention by the U.S. and the U.K. in many cases to protect Israel from Iranian retaliation and, of course, this recent bombing of Iranian nuclear facilities. We can have a debate about whether we should have done those things or shouldn't have done those things, and I wish we did when we didn't in Congress. But there's been a huge debate over Ukraine, and Ukraine hasn't relied once on direct American military intervention. So I think these are just very different kinds of cases, politically and policy-wise.
Well, the Israelis look pretty capable of handling things in their own region. I mean, after this last conflict, the United States chose to get involved. We did so, I think, wisely in a very limited, circumspect way. But the Israelis didn't seem to have much trouble with the Iranians in this latest fracas.
You're right, in northwest Iran. And then, of course, they needed us to come in and take care of the bigger problem. And then let's not forget the many volleys of missiles that Iran has fired at Israel. Of course, I hate this regime in Iran, but we've had to do the air defense for those things.
Well, not just air defense, refueling Israeli strikes, cleaning up the mess that the Israelis created by our own strikes, and we have 100 Americans on the ground in Israel manning THAAD batteries. So it's easy to sort of, Israel fights all of its own wars, okay, but when you push it a little bit, you see that there are all sorts of enablers, if you will, without which this campaign would have looked a lot different.
Okay, well, listen, let me just put it this way, and then Stacie can take the floor. If you had to devise, as a thought experiment, if you went a year ago and you said, let's imagine the cheapest, quickest, and most effective way to deal with the problem in Iran.
It was called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action.
That was working really well.
It was.
It was working great. That were going to the Iranians under Biden to fuel their proxies. But look, I mean, if you had to devise, let's not say a solution, but a remedy to the problem that was immediately in front of us, I think you would be hard-pressed to come up with one that ended with less U.S. risk and exposure than what actually played out. I think it was a real boon for us strategically.
Hello, I'm Grace Parkover, Content Associate at War on the Rocks. We're going to pause for a moment to bring you a preview of the Iran Reckoning, a new War on the Rocks members-only podcast hosted by renowned Iran expert Afshan Ostavar. In this episode, Afshan talks with Fabian Hintz about the evolution of Iran's missile program and what it reveals about the regime's long-term strategic thinking. Take a listen.
Why was the Islamic Republic and the Islamic Revolutionary Guards, the IRGC, why did they turn to missiles as something that they ended up investing in so heavily for so many decades?
In the beginning, there was quite a bit of reluctance. There was this idea that they would hit civilians in Baghdad. That would be unacceptable. But in the end, they came around the idea of doing it. And they started to acquire the first ballistic missiles for the IRGC, which in itself is a pretty fascinating story. Surprisingly, the Iranians are very open about the early times of the missile program, so we have all the details. And the very first missiles they got were basically not even Iranian operated. They were Scuds delivered by Gaddafi, the Libyan dictator, who had his own issues with the US, but especially his own issues with Saudi Arabia. And he gave this detachment of Scud missiles and operators to the Iranians to begin their retaliatory strikes against cities like Baghdad. And that's really the starting point of everything.
What was your takeaway from that 2020 attack? One, of course, they struck back against the United States for killing Qasem Soleimani. So that was escalatory. That was making good on a threat that they had put forward many times before. So there was that sense of trying to reclaim sort of a deterrence quality from their missiles, right? As well as using them in terms of retaliation. But what did you learn about the missiles themselves, right? Because from my vantage point, this was the first real major attack of Iran's contemporary missile system.
So that's quite interesting because when you look at these early attacks, they were not yet that accurate. So the very first strike against ISIS targets in eastern Syria, they themselves released footage of the impact, probably recorded from UAVs, and we could also see the impacts in satellite imagery, and you could see what they were aiming for and basically that they missed it. And interestingly enough, the commander of the IRGC missile force later in an interview said that Khomeini had complained about the accuracy. We know that Khomeini, Iran's supreme leader, was really focused on accuracy, made it the number one priority of the entire missile program. And apparently he got proper battle damage assessments afterwards and then complained that it wasn't satisfactory. And then we gradually saw the accuracy increase. I would say that these systems were reasonably accurate and accurate enough for the tasks they were designed to do.
So if you are the new commander of Iran's missile program, right, and you saw what you were able to achieve in 2024 and you saw what you were able to achieve in the 12-day war, are you more committed to the missile program? Are there lessons that you've learned that you'll now sort of take the missile program in a new direction, or are you sticking with what you've always done and just continue to make that incremental advancement in terms of capability and accuracy?
So I would say that when you look at the proxy strategy, especially with Lebanese Hezbollah, there's probably a good chance that there will be a major shift in strategy just because it hasn't worked. But with the missile program, I think they're going to continue for a number of reasons. I think they're even going to double down on it. The first is that there are just no alternatives. They imposed real costs on the Israelis. That alone is a significant cost they managed to impose on the Israelis. Of course, it wasn't enough to deter an attack, that's true, but the other alternative is to do basically nothing.
That was a preview of the Iran Reckoning, available only to War on the Rocks members. To listen to the full episode and more members-only content, join us at warontherocks.com/membership. Now, back to the show.
I think that's a short-term view. I agree. There has been a lot of behind the scenes. And I mean, the Red Sea battle, all the missile intercepts, and the fact that we don't have enough SM-6, we were firing SM-3, which is like $30 million a shot to intercept missiles that were going towards Israel or other parties because of Israel's actions, are consequential and really necessary for Israel to have done what it did to all of Iran's proxies and Tehran itself. That being said, I do think that Iran is in a dramatically weakened position. I'm not sure that's going to satisfy the Israeli government, especially this one, where you're already seeing fringe parties are causing problems for the prime minister, and he has found distracting with outside enemies has been an effective way of maintaining the support he needs to keep his government in power. And there's no way to end this other than perpetually mowing the grass or regime change. And we've seen that regime change, you can succeed at deposing someone, but building in place something that is not a threat and actually an effective government is a much harder task.
Well, let's all agree that regime change is not a good idea anywhere. I think the track record
That's where this bus takes us. I'm telling you. Everyone's talking about Iran like it's over. I want to talk a little bit about the ideological components of all this. Not our own ideologies, although we have them. We can talk about those too. But I think it's really interesting, and I've been saying this mostly in private since Trump was first elected the first time. It's really interesting what Trump becoming president has done to the neoconservative movement, in that it seems like there was a split right from the beginning between neoconservatives who mostly cared about Israel and the Middle East and neoconservatives who mostly cared about the Russian threat. And I'm not going to name names here, but we all know who we're talking about for the most part. We can all sort through mentally who belongs primarily in each camp. And it's more of a continuum, but a lot of the people in the latter camp, the people, neocons that cared most about Russia, signed the letters, and a lot of the neocons who cared mostly about Israel joined the administration. And it's been interesting seeing that evolve, as well as seeing how different people who are sort of very pro-Trump restrainers, not necessarily in the administration, but on the outside, are trying to compete about what the narrative of what the Iran strikes meant. Like, was it a victory for some kind of restraint? Or was it actually the culmination of FDD and commentary's dreams? You know, I'm throwing that out there. I don't really know exactly where I come down on it, but would love to hear all your thoughts.
I think that the presidency as an institution is way too powerful and should be brought to heel. But that's sort of a howling at the moon, cry in the desert type thing to say. But this administration has a unique attribute about it where the opinions of one person matter enormously. Donald Trump, I think it was in May, about 4 or 5 weeks before the balloon went up in Israel, was asked, are you trying to prevent Netanyahu from scuttling diplomacy, from doing something to scuttle diplomacy? And Trump has this sort of cheeky look on his face and says, I want to be honest here. Yes, I did. And so in the span of 6 weeks, you went from, I'm trying to prevent Netanyahu from scuttling my diplomacy, Netanyahu scuttles diplomacy, and the Americans bomb Iran. So there's a tremendous swing and variation that's at play here. So all of which is responding or trying to respond to your question in the sense that there's either not a lot of ideological content, it's a sort of whimsical variation, or it contains all ideologies. It contains FDD and restraint at the same time. So I'll leave it to the political folks to sort out which or either of those it may be. But I think it's very difficult for we as sort of scholars and strategists to pin down and say, and I'm sorry, I apologize to everyone in advance, this is the Trump doctrine. I just think it's too incoherent at this point to try to pin down in that way.
Yeah, I agree with that. I look at the administration as acting on principles and motivations that are conservative in the old-fashioned sense of the term, and that in foreign policy are premised on a non-transformational foreign policy. So the president has been repeatedly clear in this, including in his speeches in Saudi Arabia recently, that we're not out to transform other societies, whether it's Iran or Russia, but a willingness to take calibrated risks when it's in the American interest and can achieve discernible near-term. So like taking out the Iranian nuclear capability, I think we can all agree that's a good thing. I would say the administration's approach was to do so in a way that minimized our risk and involvement. And in that sense, is a defeat for those, I would say, neoconservatives and even some like liberal institutionalists who would look at the Middle East and say, until we've converted the main adversary there into a democracy, we haven't really done the job. And I don't think that's what Trump is about. There will be debates within the, let's just call it like broadly conservative, realist camp in foreign policy about where and when to maximize either diplomacy or military pressure, operating under the constraints that we're under. But that's the key point. Going back to what we were talking about earlier, it's an administration that does recognize we don't have a limitless supply of weapons. It's calibrating its risk-taking accordingly. And I think it's calibrating the goals in foreign policy accordingly.
I agree that it isn't an entirely coherent approach, whether it's restraint or neocon sort of impulses, but it's important to remember when you go back to how the Trump administration dealt with the Houthis before Iran. They escalated significantly and had the 2 months of bombing to degrade their capabilities, but then got out when they realized that they weren't going to be able to totally finish the job and cut bait.
When they realized that J.D. Vance was right in the Signalgate chat.
But they did something that Biden, frankly, was unwilling to do, where he was using the minimal amount of force possible in a very restrained way and didn't hit the Houthis hard enough that they were willing to stop. And that you could then potentially draw down the air defense forces in the region, though we haven't because of Israel, which is a separate related issue. But I don't see a coherence there that you can easily point to, and they're going to spin it whatever way they feel like at the moment. But you have seen a willingness to conserve, but normally hitting hard at some point with Iran too, the limited strike.
Well, I think that's wrong. I think you have to hold in mind two thoughts that are completely compatible. One is that the administration is willing to use military force, including in ways that sometimes may upset those who want more restraint, but also that it has consistently taken a diplomacy-first approach in all of these equations. By the way, in the case of Iran, in the case of the Houthis, in the case of Russia, the starting point was to say, we want this resolved, we want X, Y, and Z to end. When the other side then flaunted that, in the case of the Houthis and with Iran, there was a military response. But with both of those, that was then tied back to a diplomatic process of some kind. And I think that's important, whether you agree or disagree with it. It's an integration of military and diplomatic power differently than what we've seen in previous administrations.
Of some kind is doing a lot of work in what you just said. When the president sends Steve Witkoff with no experts on nuclear anything, or even diplomats, to talk to the Iranians or Putin in a closed room, yeah, there is a diplomatic process of some kind. Can you get to a nuclear deal with the Iranians without including those people? I think they did in one meeting eventually. I don't think you can. And so, again, I'm only bringing it up again because you brought it up again. I'm on board with the diplomacy, and I do think they are doing diplomacy of some kind. It's just not the kind of diplomacy, more in the manner and character in which they approach it, that I would like to see. But they don't listen to me, so it's fine.
The zero enrichment thing was clearly a poison pill. I think everybody in this room knew that zero enrichment wasn't going to happen. And you had this variation where you have Witkoff saying they can go to 3 2/3%. The neocons have a conniption fit. A week later, they're all saying zero enrichment. And then you've bombed Iran, right? This is not a sort of military instrument working hand in glove with diplomacy. You had outlandish political demands going into diplomacy in terms of zero enrichment. I think if any of us was betting our kids' college fund, we would never have put it on the idea that Iran would agree to zero enrichment. But that was the demand. Understandably, very predictably, the negotiations did not go very well, very quickly. And then you've bombed
Israel
Iran.
killed the negotiator.
Killed the actual negotiator, worth pointing out. A little bit of symbolism there, not symbolism for him, it was very literal. But so I think that in a way, in the main way, the military instrument is working counterproductively with diplomacy. And the way that the question about the American position, I think they could have gotten a JCPOA plus. All they needed was a JCPOA that said, instead of a sunset in 15 years, it's a sunset in 20 years for some of the various provisions. And that they would have been able to say, Barack Obama's deal was a terrible, hippie, communist, left-wing, non-proliferation deal. We were tough, and we got 20 years instead of 15 years. And politically, that's enough. Strategically, it's enough because you have an Iran that's a pain in the neck regionally, but doesn't have a nuclear deterrent. And then that's the sort of pivot, if you will. That's walking away from the Middle East. But they chose not to do that for reasons that are still unclear to me, that they settled on zero enrichment.
Well, I just say, look, I'm confused. At the start of the discussion, we were all in agreement. We have a scarcity problem. We can't be strong everywhere. I mean, I just finished writing a book about great power diplomacy.
Plug it.
It's called Great Power Diplomacy, The Skill of Statecraft from Attila the Hun to Kissinger.
Oh, boy.
Well, what I found over and over again is that when a great power is confronted with, let's say, the simultaneity problem, they have done historically broadly what the Trump administration has came into office trying to do, which is to use diplomacy in, let's say, two of the three theaters, not just like naive diplomacy, sweet reasonableness, but strong diplomacy backed by military power, to downgrade the problems in those theaters to concentrate military on the primary theater. Justin, when I look at what the administration did coming into office, the secondary and tertiary theaters, so Europe and the Middle East, its starting point was diplomacy. It pissed off a lot of people. It was the correct move, in my view, but it was, let's see if we can resolve the Ukraine conflict diplomatically, and let's reach out to the Iranians, even if there's political risk in doing so. It was diplomacy first. Now, you can disagree with the tactics, but that's consistent with what we've been describing in this discussion of scarcity. It's a diplomacy first approach. And secondly, I would say it's the exact opposite of what you've said about the military power working against the grain of diplomacy. Both with Iran and with Ukraine, I think the administration basically has shifted gears to accumulate leverage behind a diplomatic position. But the goal is still diplomatic. I think the goal with Russia is to say, we're ending the war on terms that are not just favorable, that aren't just a victory for Russia. I think with the Iranians, it's a Libya-style outcome where there's a literal dismantling of the nuclear program, or something like the Saudi idea of a regionally managed peaceful atom-type project. Again, whether you agree with those policies or not, I think they're consistent with the kind of, let's take scarcity and trade-off seriously that we were talking about at the start of the conversation.
We could keep this argument going forever, and maybe we will on a future episode, but I want to shift gears a little bit. So Phil Zellico wrote this amazing essay last year in the Texas National Security Review, which we ran for over 7 years before handing it over to our friends at the University of Texas. And in it, he argues lots of different things. But one of the things he notices is that if you look at the closeness and industrial integration and coordination between Iran, Russia, China, North Korea today, it's much deeper than what you saw between the Axis powers in the lead up to World War II and maybe even throughout World War II in terms of their industrial integration, certainly. And so, Justin, I think you made a great point earlier about our allies get a vote, but our adversaries do too. And given how closely coordinated they are, I mean, North Korea is fighting in Ukraine. China is supplying Russia. Deeply so is Iran. And there's co-production agreements and all that. So how much choice do we actually have when it comes to this sequencing? And how much of it is we're just going to have to be reactive and responsive? It's obviously both, but Stacie, I want to start with you.
I think that is a really interesting point that Phil made, and one that probably is in part due to the fact that our global economies are so much more integrated today than they were in World War II. But I'm not in the camp. I'm going to disagree with my boss. I'm not in the axis of upheaval. I'm not worried about outright formal alliances. And I'm not even sure they would entirely coordinate their behavior. They're all very self-interested, as you would expect. But I do think that they are opportunistic enough and that they have goals to revise the current international system. And if they're presented with opportunities where they can achieve those goals and they feel like they have the ability to do so, which is happening because of the shifting balance in the Indo-Pacific, and Russia just seems to be a little bit less rational about how it goes about things, that you could find yourself in a real problem and be facing simultaneous challenges. It has happened in the recent past. Like you think about North Korea, the crisis that emerged in 1994 when Saddam had made the feint on Kuwait again, and the U.S. sent tens of thousands of troops. It was this massive mobilization and then back down. And that would be cost imposing on us. We can't respond conventionally in that way everywhere. And the situation's fundamentally different. What we haven't really talked that much about, but I'll bring up again, is 3 out of 4 of these adversaries have nuclear weapons. And they have what we want to call non-strategic or tactical nuclear weapons. And they may find that those are useful instruments that they're willing to employ for overarching political objectives because they think they can coerce the United States or some of our allies.
To me, the most interesting, Iran and North Korea, to my view, are sort of the less interesting parties here. And the Russia-China relationship is the more interesting one. And let me sort of beat up on the Biden administration in absentia here. U.S. policy contributed to the closeness of Russia and China that exists today. It wasn't the only variable, but it was a major variable. It's not natural if you had a sort of get the map out discussion about alignment of countries. You wouldn't say, well, Russia and China should really align together in isolation from U.S. policy. I think it's not at all hard to figure out why Russia and China are so close, because they don't have a lot of options. They kind of need each other. But the substance of the relationship is not symmetrical. Russia is very much the junior partner in the sort of Russia-China relationship. That's bad from an American point of view. If China is the sort of pacing threat or pacing challenge or whatever we're supposed to call it, you want it to be not in an advantageous sort of asymmetric relationship where it's extracting more from Russia than Russia is extracting from it. So if U.S. policy contributed to pushing those countries together, surely variation in U.S. policy could, at a minimum case, not push them closer together and perhaps even pull them apart. So I'm not going the full reverse Kissinger here, but I think just on paper, this looks unnatural. It looks bad from an American point of view, and U.S. policy should be thinking about how to undo it.
Yeah, I think the premise is right, that the Russia, Iran, China, what do they call it, CRINC?
Yeah, let's avoid all the kind of obnoxious taglines for it. But yes.
Is tighter than probably what you saw in the mid or late 30s amongst the Axis powers. What's interesting to me is from the standpoint of competitive advantages, at this point, if that's baked in, it's not necessarily trending all negative for us. So if you're America's primary rival, China, and you're looking at the game board of your friends on the map, what do you see? You've got an Iran that just got smacked by a regional player that's a fraction of its size. And you've got a Russia that spent 3 years trying to subjugate Ukraine and has become more dependent on China along the way and has lost 1 million casualties. So it doesn't mean that we're in a great position overall. What it means is that our primary adversaries' dependencies, like Iran and Russia, are deepening their dependencies on China over time in a way that I think is going to create a lot of headaches for China, could create opportunities for the United States, even if the Russians and Chinese were operating more closely than they are at present. We should always have a competitive mindset and be alive to where the very real differences in interests lie. I think primarily in the Russian Far East, in Central Asia, and there are tools at our disposal in the right context.
India also.
India. So remember Shinzo Abe's idea that I think a lot of people didn't pick up on at the time in the US a few years ago. His basic point was that Russia's becoming more dependent on China because China's the only supplier of capital and infrastructure development in the Russian Far East and increasingly in Central Asia. And that one response to that could be for US allies and partners in North Asia, like Japan and South Korea, to be given investment opportunities in Russia that compete with the Chinese. Whether you agree with that or not, you can imagine something like that being part of a larger carrots and sticks type approach that is geared towards trying to reorient Russian attention and energy towards Asia and away from Europe. I think that would be in the American interest and may seem like a long shot, but I think we should always be alive to the opportunities to divide our rivals.
I think we're probably past the point of no return on the China-Russia relationship, but Stacie, a lot's been thrown out there. You want to add anything?
I think that we should certainly be approaching things competitively and would look to drive wedges between them. But I think it is easier said than done, and that in practice, it's going to be really difficult. I actually find the North Korean-Russian relationship to be fascinating. North Korea has freed itself up on almost sole dependence on China, where Beijing had an oversized role in supporting North Korea. And now they're gaining all kinds of combat experience, and they're seeing their weapons being employed, and they're using them. So there's a fundamental, I think, asymmetry in terms of these countries because they're looking to revise things and they're willing to take small wins. And doing so can impose disproportionate costs on the U.S. Just think about air defense being the big one because everybody's got their cheap drones or cheap missiles they're using now. And that's going to be this persistent problem where I do think that it was smart of the Trump administration to bring to an end, at least temporarily, what was going on with the Houthis. We're not going to be able to sustain those type of operations. But I worry with these countries, they don't actually have to have a deep and abiding interest. They can be acting out of self-interest in ways that might actually irritate each other, but will still present problems for us in a fundamental way.
I want to close with a conversation on arms control and diplomacy. Assuming we don't have some sort of major war or world war, and we all hope we don't, I think part of the diplomatic path forward is going to involve different kinds of arms control with all the countries that we just named, all the 4 countries, the main adversaries. To the extent that the Cold War and post-Cold War arms control regime still exists, which it does in parts, and Bridge, of course, worked on New START, I believe, in the past. One of the major problems is it doesn't include China on so many things. The Iran case is self-explanatory. North Korea, we'll see they seem to have no interest in ever giving up their nuclear weapons. I certainly wouldn't if I was in their shoes. But would just like to get your thoughts on how you all think about this, and not just nuclear arms control, but if there's a role for conventional arms control and what you'd be advising the Trump administration to start thinking about on that front.
I mean, I agree. I think you would need some sort of arms control regime because the existing one is totally crumbled and was bilateral and not sufficient for the world that we are facing today. Right now, the biggest problem here is China. I mean, China has no interest or willingness to get involved in any sort of agreements that limited itself. Its deterrence strategy rests on the idea of opacity. It doesn't want to be transparent about its forces, and that would have to shift for this to happen. And I don't know, maybe you start with 2 and you can include a third, but it seems really unlikely at this current moment in time. I do think that these sort of big policy pronouncements, something like Golden Dome, where the U.S. is doing something that could be tremendously destabilizing if we failed it, because interceptors in space not only could reduce a country's second strike capability, but they could be used as offensive space capabilities, offensive ground attack capabilities. That might shake things up enough to spur some sort of arms control in the future and give you a bargaining chip that you can use. But right now, both China and Russia have been investing in a lot of countermeasures to overcome U.S. air defenses and exotic, expensive capabilities, but they've made progress there. They're farther ahead than the United States on hypersonics. You had the FOBS test a few years ago that China had. And North Korea is working that way too, right? Its missiles aren't as good, but the short-range ballistic missiles it has do that maneuver like the Iskanders and are trying to develop capabilities that can circumvent something like a robust integrated air defense network.
So I think we're at a position a little bit like the British in the interwar period, 1920s, 1930s, in naval power, where the Washington naval treaties had supposedly created something like a framework that their potential adversaries, the Germans and the Japanese, were going to be tied to. They eventually woke up to the fact that they hadn't recapitalized their surface fleet, but by golly, their adversaries, and particularly the Japanese, had. And so our adversaries have stolen a night march on us. Stacie's right. If the American public knew how far we are falling behind both the Chinese and the Russians in really critical nuclear capabilities, I think they would be alarmed. I think the right approach is something like the United States first has to reinvest in its own resources and at least start the process of recapitalizing the program of record. Yes, investing in national missile defense, but until we've at least moved out on that.
It's like the Reagan playbook, basically.
Yeah, until you've done that, right now the Russians and the Chinese don't have any reason whatsoever to engage in meaningful arms control. Why would you? If you're the Chinese, why would you tie yourself to something when your main adversary, the United States, is actually falling behind? The 2 points would be, like on Russia, it could be that because of the conventional force losses that the Russians take in this war, in coming years, they're going to face a real budget crunch, sort of like, on a smaller scale, what the Soviets had in the Reagan era, where they have to choose between capital investments in their conventional forces or maintaining this nuclear arsenal. That's an opportunity for the United States to confront them with budgetary trade-offs that force them into spending patterns or deployment patterns in nuclear forces that favor ourselves. With the Chinese, however, and this is contra conventional wisdom, I wonder if we really even need anytime soon an arms control framework with them, because if they want to actually race to parity and they want to match us in size, I'm not sure that really matters. I think that could end up being an unforced misallocation of resources on their part. They may be in the middle of a mistake. If they get to parity versus half parity versus, doesn't really change the strategic equation from our standpoint, versus like putting that into the conventional forces that would be needed, the short-range missiles and naval capabilities for a Taiwan-type contingency. So I would do it in that order. Get moving on rebuilding our strengths at home, use that as an incentive, plus the drain of the Ukraine war, to engage the Russians, and then save the Chinese for a later day. I just don't think that we're going to be there with them anytime soon.
I'll just make 2 points. One is that I think the equilibrium in which we find ourselves is one that really satisfies no one. Everyone's sort of unhappy with it for varying reasons, but it might be stable. It might be pretty stable for a while. And I think that, to Wes's point about sort of focusing at home, recapitalizing, number one, the tab on that, the bill for that is eye-poppingly,
enormous,
eye-wateringly expensive, which is going to amplify the trade-off question that animated this discussion in the first place. And I wonder whether other countries, perhaps not Russia, but perhaps Russia, but particularly China, might have the same sort of two-step approach that you laid out for the United States. Focus on recapitalizing at home and then go out into the world. But then that will have created new realities with which any arms control would have to grapple in the future. So I think, this is my sort of stock and trade, but this unhappy situation in which we find ourselves might be sticky in ways that we don't like.
What a terrific conversation. Thank you all for joining the show. Thank you for listening to this episode of the War on the Rocks podcast. If you want to listen to the Iran Reckoning and our other members-only podcasts, read our members-only newsletters, and access our members-only app, please become a member at warontherocks.com/membership. The price will go up next month, so now is the time to lock in our price while it's as low as it is now. Again, warontherocks.com/membership. Stay safe and stay healthy.